17-year-old Rachel Trlica of Fort Worth, Texas, wanted to get in some last-minute Christmas shopping at the Seminary South Shopping Center. She was recently married to Thomas Trlica and stepmother to his 2-year-old son. Rachel had met Thomas when he briefly dated her sister Deborah. Despite the strange circumstances, the three got along well, and Deborah had recently come to live with Rachel and Thomas. On December 23rd, Rachel called her good friend, 14-year-old Renee Wilson, and asked her to tag along. Renee was up for the shopping trip, but wanted to be home by 4 p.m. She had a Christmas party to attend with her new boyfriend, Terry Mosley, and wanted plenty of time to get done up. Renee asked Terry to go along, but he had other plans. Terry's 9-year-old sister, Julie Ann Moseley, was happy to take his place, and after a phone call, begging her mother, she was given permission to go along. The three women left sometime before noon, and after making a quick stop, arrived at the shopping center. Several witnesses reported seeing the girls at the mall. When the girls failed to return home by 4 p.m., their families became concerned, and by 6 p.m., Rachel's younger brother Rusty was on the scene with his mother. They found the car locked up with Christmas presents inside. They went to every store in the mall, having the girls paged, but there was no response. Police were called, and when they arrived, they did a sweep of the mall. Several witnesses gave conflicting accounts of seeing the girls in the parking lot in the company of a man. In some cases, the man was forcing them into a van. In others, he was wearing the uniform of a security guard and had the girls in his truck. By 11 p.m., several family members and friends were staking out Rachel's car, waiting to see if they would return or if anyone else would show up at the vehicle, but their efforts were without result. The next day, Thomas Trlica received a strange letter in the mail, alleged to have been written by Rachel, explaining that they had gone to Houston and would return in a week. The letter sparked controversy, with no one believing Rachel had actually written it, and even accusations that it had in fact been written by Rachel's sister, Deborah. As the years passed, Thomas would move away and sever all ties to the family. Deborah would become a person of interest, at least in the minds of the family, and especially in the mind of her brother Rusty. Private investigators would make claims of abduction and sex slavery. A convicted murderer would claim that he had met the girls years after their disappearance, and several active rapists and killers in the Texas area would become targets of speculation and scrutiny as to their possible involvement. In 2001, a witness would come forward and claim to have interacted with the security guard who was reported to have been seen with the girls. A convicted child molester and murderer would take credit for the crime, and the indictment of a man on a different but similar case would bring his name into the suspect list. All of these years later, and the truth still has not been uncovered. Rachel's brother Rusty has never given up the search for his sister, and with the help of a private investigator, believes he has proof that his sister is still alive and in the Fort Worth area. The three missing girls would become known as the Fort Worth Three, and despite a startling lack of media coverage, for many, the case remains just as heart-wrenching as that day in 1974 when the girls seemed to vanish without a trace. What happened to Rachel Trlica, Renee Wilson, and Julianne Mosley on December 23, 1974? Is it possible they fell victim to a crazed killer? Did they choose to walk away and have failed to contact anyone over the past 43 years? Did Rachel's sister Deborah know more than she was telling? Or does the answer lie with a convicted murderer with a long list of victims? This is Trace Evidence, Episode 9, The Disappearance of the Fort Worth Three. Welcome to Trace Evidence. I'm your host, Stephen Pacheco. Today's episode focuses on the unexplained disappearance of three young women from a Fort Worth, Texas mall in 1974. In over 40 years, little information has come to the surface, and the disappearance remains shrouded in mystery. Before we move into the case, just a few notes about the show. Trace Evidence is a weekly true crime podcast focused on missing persons and unsolved murders. We are available across multiple platforms, and we are on iTunes, Google Play Music, Stitcher, and more. I've recently launched a Patreon for those of you who wish to support the podcast. It can be found at patreon.com/traceevidence. This podcast is a complete one-man operation, so if you enjoy it and wish to help support it, please check out the Patreon. Links, information, and more items, including YouTube videos and full episode transcripts, can be found on our official website at trace-evidence.com. If you'd like to contact me, you can email me at traceevidencepod@gmail.com, tweet me at traceevpod, that's TRACEEVPOD on Twitter, or join the Facebook discussion group simply by searching for Trace Evidence Podcast or clicking the direct link on our website. If you have questions, comments, or case suggestions, I'd love to hear from you. Now that we've gotten all of that out of the way, today we look into the case of the mysterious disappearance of Rachel Trlica, Renee Wilson, and Julie Ann Moseley, more commonly known as the Fort Worth Three. Seminary South Shopping Center opened in South Fort Worth, Texas in March of 1962. The mall itself was built over Katy Lake, which was drained, and a complex drainage system was put into place to prevent flooding. It was the first major shopping mall in the area, and boasted many popular stores of the time, including a large Sears. The mall itself was opened by Homart Development Company, which was in fact the mall development arm of Sears itself. Within several years, other major retailers came into the mall, developing and expanding the site. By 1974, the mall expanded beyond clothing and retail stores, growing to also contain a movie theater and a bowling alley. Today, Seminary South is known as the Fort Worth Town Center. Mary Trlica was 17 years old in 1974, and tended to go by her middle name, Rachel, which is how I will refer to her from here on out. Despite her age, Rachel was married to Thomas Trlica, a man who had, interestingly enough, been involved in a short relationship with Rachel's sister, Deborah Arnold, Arnold being Rachel's maiden name. Thomas was a widower and had a 2-year-old son who Rachel's reported to have cared very much about and treated him as her own. Deborah has since stated that her relationship with Thomas was short-lived and never serious. According to Deborah, she and Rachel grew up in a tough environment with a strict and violent father who both were frightened of. By December of 1974, Rachel was living with her husband Thomas, and Deborah moved out of the family home, going to stay with the married couple. According to Deborah, this wasn't awkward, despite her history with Thomas, and the three got along well. Rachel has a brother named Rusty, who was still living in the Arnold family home at the time. Rachel was a lovely woman, standing 5'8" and weighing around 108 pounds. She had long brownish blonde hair and eyes which would shift from blue to green. On the morning of December 23rd, Rachel decided to take a trip to Seminary South Shopping Center to do some last-minute Christmas shopping. She asked her mother to go along, but she elected to stay home. Reportedly, Rachel's father was sick at the time and her mother didn't want to leave him alone. With her mother unable to attend, Rachel reached out to her close friend, 14-year-old Lisa Renee Wilson, who decided to tag along. Like her friend Rachel, Lisa also chose to go by her middle name, Renee, which is how I will refer to her from this point on. Renee was visiting her grandmother's house that morning and didn't appear to have any intentions of going shopping. Across the street from Renee's grandmother's was the Mosley home. When Renee's mother was at work, she would stay with her grandmother and became close with the Mosley kids across the street. Among the kids were Julie Ann, a 9-year-old, and her older brother Terry. Terry was 15 in 1974 and knew that Renee had a crush on him. The two began dating, and on the morning of December 23rd, Terry presented Renee with a promise ring, which she enthusiastically accepted. At some point that morning, Renee received a call from Rachel. Rachel told Renee that she was planning on going to Seminary South to get some Christmas gifts and asked if she wanted to come along. Rachel was 3 years older than Renee, but they had been friends for a while. At first, Renee wasn't interested. She asked Terry if he wanted to go, and he told her that he couldn't, as he'd made plans to go visit a sick friend that morning. Since Terry would be busy, Renee told Rachel that she would come along, but she had to be back by 4 p.m. She was going to a Christmas party with Terry that evening and wanted plenty of time to ensure that she looked her best. Renee stood 5'2" tall and weighed around 110 pounds. She had brown hair with auburn red highlights and brown eyes. That morning she was reportedly wearing red and white sneakers and a yellow t-shirt with the words "Sweet Honesty" printed on them, bluish purple hip hugger pants, and a promise ring with a small stone. Her clothing has been somewhat debated, as it's also been suggested she was wearing a white pullover sweater with the words "Sweet Honesty" printed in yellow, and that she may have worn Oxford shoes and not red and white ones. Although Terry had plans and couldn't accompany Renee and Rachel to the mall that morning, his 9-year-old sister Julie Ann was excited by the prospect and asked if she could come along. Julie was bored and begged Renee to take her along. She begged her family to let her. Julie's family knew Renee well, but were unfamiliar with Rachel and were reticent to allow her to tag along with a stranger. Renee was best friends with Rachel and told the family she'd keep an eye on Julie. Hesitantly, her mother agreed and allowed Julie to go shopping with the older girls. Julie was 4 foot 3 inches tall and weighed approximately 85 pounds. She had light brown hair and blue eyes. Rachel arrived in her Oldsmobile 95. Despite its name, the Oldsmobile 95 was the model name of the flagship Oldsmobile, which was manufactured between 1940 and 1996. Sometime before 12 p.m., the three girls packed into the car and headed on their way. Before arriving at Seminary South, they made a quick stop at a local Army-Navy store where Rachel had some gifts on layaway. They then continued on, arriving at Seminary South, parking on the upper level near Sears. Multiple witnesses report seeing the three girls in the mall that day, with several specifically remembering the "Sweet Honesty" saying on Renee's shirt. The timeline of what occurred that day in the mall is subject to debate and can't be known for certain. What is known is that at some point, the girls returned to the car because several Christmas gifts were found locked inside. When 4 p.m. came and went, all three girls' families began to grow concerned, but at the same time didn't think it was completely unusual for them to run a little late on a shopping trip. As the evening grew longer, it was decided that they needed to head over to Seminary South to check and see if the girls were still there, or if perhaps they'd experienced car trouble along the way. There were no signs of the girls along the way, and upon arriving at the mall, the car was quickly located at approximately 6 p.m. The car was locked and still parked on the upper lot near Sears. They noticed the gifts locked inside the vehicle and assumed the girls had come to the car to lighten their loads and then gone back in to finish shopping. After searching the mall and grounds extensively, the three girls were nowhere to be found. As panic began to set in, the police were contacted and began to investigate. There is some debate between the families and police, though. Police maintain that the initial report was taken seriously and that they approached the situation with foul play and abduction in mind. In the years since, members of the families have stated publicly that police did not take it seriously at all. Rusty Arnold, Rachel's younger brother, who was 11 at the time, has said that the police treated the whole incident as though the three women had chosen to run away. Rusty has stated, quote, "They didn't even fingerprint the car when it was first found. They treated them as runaways for the first year. My sister did not run away. Me and my mother went through every store." End quote. According to reports of the time, upon inspection of the car, 3 $50 savings bonds which were known to be in the glove box were missing. Contrarily, in a 2012 interview, Rusty would state that the savings bonds were in fact found in the vehicle. Police released the car to Rachel's husband just the next day, which makes it highly unlikely the vehicle was thoroughly processed for forensic evidence, though at the time, forensics was much less efficient than it is now. Also, it has been reported that police refused to come into the mall until around 11 p.m. when it closed. Whether or not this was based on an assumption that the girls were still shopping is unknown. According to police, they went through the mall, interviewing possible witnesses. Reportedly, one store clerk informed them that a female shopper had told him that she had seen the girls earlier, and that she had seen a man hustling the girls into a pickup truck in the parking lot. The police were never able to locate this woman and could not verify the clerk's story. Several years later, in 1981, a male witness came forward and claims to have seen the girls being shoved into a van by an unknown man. According to the witness, he approached the man and asked what was going on. He claims the man told him that it was a family matter and to mind his own business. This story has never been fully verified either. Another woman who was at the mall that day told police a slightly different story. According to this witness, she had seen the girls riding around in a mall security car. There were many witness accounts, but none could agree on the details. Nothing certain could be gained from these accounts, but police began to wonder if it was possible that the girls had gotten into a vehicle with someone that one or all of them knew, and something had gone wrong along the way. Whether or not they had been abducted or some strange accident occurred is still unknown to this day. It's been reported that several family members arrived at the mall and staked out the car, wielding a shotgun and watching from a distance to see if anyone showed up acting suspicious, and with the hopes that the girls would come walking back into their lives. Unfortunately, the 3 girls did not return and seemed to have mysteriously vanished without an explanation. The case took a strange twist the next day. A letter arrived on Christmas Eve 1974. The letter was addressed to Thomas A. Trlica, Rachel's husband. On the top left corner of the envelope, Rachel's name was written. This is pointed out as strange because if indeed the letter was written by Rachel, it's odd that she was so formal in addressing her own husband. Everyone who knew the couple says that she always referred to him as Tommy and not Thomas. The letter's oddities don't stop there. The letter was postmarked, but did not list a city. There was a postal service number stamped on the envelope, reportedly 76083. However, the 3 is said to appear backwards, making some wonder if it's actually an incomplete 8, a result of the stamp not being fully depressed on the envelope. If this is the case, then the zip code should actually read 76088, which would denote the city of Weatherford, Texas, which is approximately 30 miles west of Fort Worth. It should be noted that the original 76083 is a zip code that's not used in Texas, and it's simply not possible that a letter mailed from another state would arrive in Fort Worth, Texas within the span of 24 hours. There's also some debate that the zip code could have denoted Eliasville, Texas, as the point of origin. Eliasville is approximately 100 miles west of Fort Worth. Following further investigation, the United States Postal Service declared that the letter had in fact been mailed from Fort Worth itself. In total, the letter read, quote, "I know I'm gonna catch it, but we just had to get away. We're going to Houston. See you in about a week. The car is in Sears' upper lot. Love, Rachel." End quote. The letter itself was written on a large sheet of paper in what has been described as a childish script. The L at the end of Rachel's name appears to have originally been scrolled as an E and then written over, making it taller and more like an L. The letter's been hotly debated, but almost no one believes that Rachel wrote the letter. Rachel's family says it doesn't resemble her handwriting, and that it looked as though it had been written by a small child or an illiterate or uneducated person. Extensive testing has been conducted on the letter, and there was reportedly DNA located years later, which did not match Rachel's. In the years since, the DNA has never matched anyone tested nor anyone in the system currently. In addition to this inconsistency, handwriting analysis has suggested that the letter was written by a right-handed person, and Rachel was left-handed. According to Rachel's husband Tommy, he retrieved the letter that morning. It was in the mailbox with no other mail. The envelope was sealed shut, and the 10-cent stamp had been canceled that day, December 24th, 1974. Rachel's younger brother Rusty, when asked years later, stated, quote, "It is my opinion Rachel did not write that letter." End quote. Years later, when Rachel's husband Tommy was asked, he stated, quote, "I never thought it came from Rachel." End quote. Deborah Arnold, Rachel's sister and Tommy's ex-girlfriend, who was living with the couple at the time of the disappearance, has said that Rachel invited her along on the trip that day, but that she turned it down because she was tired and planned on staying in bed longer, and she was present the next morning when Tommy found the letter in the mailbox. Deborah's knowledge of the case and activity around this time will become more important later. Over the next several years, investigators continued to hit the roadblock of little to no evidence in the case. There are witness reports, none of which can be corroborated, and all of which conflict with each other. Police continue following the theory that the girls may have gotten into a vehicle with someone they knew, or someone they felt comfortable going with, and foul play took place afterwards. Police have stated, quote, "We can say that they were at one point seen with one individual, but we believe there was more than one involved." End quote. By the spring of 1975, the families of the missing girls came together and hired a private investigator. John Swaim was a headstrong investigator who believed the police weren't doing enough with the case. Swaim reportedly built up a large file on the case with reports from people who claimed to have the truth. Swaim called press conferences and reportedly forced police to allow him to examine their files. The police had previously searched a swampy area near Port Lavaca, Texas, some 300 miles south of Fort Worth and 127 miles east of Houston. The city sits on the west side of Lavaca Bay, which is an arm of the Matagorda Bay, an estuary in the Gulf of Mexico. Swaim claimed the girls' remains could be found in this area, and 100 volunteers showed up for a search, but nothing was located. Swaim would also claim that a man who refused to identify himself had called, wanting to collect reward money in exchange for information about the disappearance. Nothing came of this claim, though, and in 1979, Swaim died of a drug overdose, which police ruled a suicide. As stipulated in legal documents left behind by Swaim, all of his files on all of his cases, including the Fort Worth 3, were destroyed following his death. Whether or not there was information of value which was lost in the destruction cannot be known for sure. Throughout the rest of the 70s, several sets of human remains were found, and each time it was believed that the Fort Worth 3 had finally been located, but testing always proved otherwise. A lot of supposed witnesses called in tips claiming to have seen the girls around Texas and the world in the days, weeks, and years following their disappearance, but none of these tips were able to be verified. Several psychics even called police suggesting locations of the body, but they never panned out either. So what happened to Rachel Trlica, Renee Wilson, and Julie Mosley? That's the burning question, and unfortunately, what possible answers do exist, they are thin, suspect, or outright ludicrous. Police continued to investigate, and over time, the case grew more and more cold. Then suddenly, 25 years after the disappearance, in January of 2001, Fort Worth police officially reopened the investigation. Detective Tom Bocher was assigned to take charge of the case. At a press conference, Bocher gave an update on the case. According to the detective, there were nearly 20 new witnesses, many of whom saw the 3 girls at the mall that fateful evening. According to Bocher, quote, "That combined with DNA evidence and the way DNA is collected and processed since this case was originally investigated makes for a better outcome." End quote. According to Bocher, the police still followed their original theory. They believed it involved someone the girls knew or someone they felt safe with. Bocher would go on to say that after exiting the mall, the girls ran into, quote, "foul play and met up with some unfortunate circumstances," end quote. By this time, in 2001, Bocher believed the girls were most likely deceased and revealed that they had sent over 150 letters to coroners' offices in the 5 surrounding states regarding unidentified female remains found over the years, but none of these had matched. In regard to suspects, Bocher was a little more specific. Bocher said, quote, "This case has so many possible suspects. It's still an open and active case," end quote. Later, he would say that the police believe they've narrowed the suspect pool down to under 5. The years which have passed complicate the case further, with police saying that some witnesses have passed away, others' memories have grown foggy. 25 years is a long time. People forget, or details change in their minds, and it's difficult to determine if they are accurate or not. When asked about the renewed investigation, Rusty Arnold responded, quote, "I feel like they've done more in the last 3 months than any other officer or detectives have done in the whole 26-year investigation," end quote. Perhaps it was the renewed interest from police, or simply a jogging of memory. But in April of 2001, a new witness came forward. According to this witness, he saw all 3 girls that night at Seminary South. He said that at 11:30 p.m., some 7.5 hours after the girls were supposed to have been home, he witnessed all 3 in a truck with a young male security guard who also worked for Seminary South. According to the witness, the 3 girls appeared relaxed and seemed to be in the vehicle willingly. So why did he wait so long to tell this story? According to him, he didn't. The witness claims he informed the Fort Worth police about this a few days after the disappearance, but that investigators never followed through on it. The witness was Bill Hutchins, and he was a security guard working for Sears at Seminary South during the disappearance. Hutchins had previously been a Fort Worth police officer in the 1960s. According to Hutchins, while doing a check of the parking lot that evening, he worked shifts overnight looking after the property. He had an incident with another young security guard driving through the parking lot in a pickup truck. According to Hutchins, quote, "I saw 3 girls sitting in the front seat with him, a young girl next to him, a little older next to her, and then the oldest and largest girl against the passenger door," end quote. He approached the vehicle and had a verbal dispute with the man, although the details of it are not explained. Everything seems to have been sorted out, and Hutchins says at that point, quote, "I apologize for my language. They laughed, everybody was happy. We just exchanged a few comments, then he rolled up his window and drove off." End quote. According to Hutchins, when he saw the news reports a few days later about the missing girls, he contacted the police. He tried to get in touch with the lead detective on the case, stating, quote, "I talked to his secretary, gave her my name, what I had seen, everything like that, and let it go with that, and never heard back from them." End quote. Hutchins goes on to say that he didn't think it was odd not to hear back from the police at the time. As newspaper reports got smaller and less frequent, he assumed the police had either figured it out or had different leads they were pursuing. Hutchins goes on to say that he never had a conversation with police about the incident until they finally contacted him in 2001. Police managed to locate the security guard and question him about the case all these years later. According to police, the man denied having ever seen the girls, let alone having had them in his truck. The police were adamant that they considered this a viable lead, but were working on 5 suspects at the time and not just one. Hutchins' story does corroborate the witness report from '74, the unidentified woman who told a clerk she had seen the girls being hustled into a truck. Also, if the man was a security guard, it would fit the police theory of the girls being with someone they knew or someone they felt safe with. As the years wore on, theories would rise and fall, suspects would come and go, but nothing solid could be linked to the 3 missing girls. A thorough examination of the case requires looking at all aspects, and so we will begin with the theories considered most likely, or at least, most realistic. The families have stayed fairly united over the years on almost all aspects of the case. The one dividing factor has been Rachel's sister, Debra. According to Rachel's brother, Rusty, in the beginning, he and his sister Deborah were close and worked together to try and figure out what happened to the girls. Rachel's mother kept a scrapbook of all the newspaper reports regarding the disappearance, and Rusty and Deborah would look through them, reading them time and again, hoping to find something new, something that might provide an answer. As the years wore on, Rusty became suspicious of his sister, and he wasn't the only one. Much has been speculated about Deborah's possible involvement in or knowledge of what happened to the 3 girls. In 1999, Rusty came into contact with Dan James, a private investigator who had been working on the case on his own since 1975. According to James, there are several reported sightings in the weeks after their disappearance which should be given more credence. These witness reports placed the girls in a Walmart, at a gas station, and in a country store. Notably, only Rachel and Renee are reported in these sightings, with no mention of Julie Ann. According to James, Rachel has been spotted much more recently, even up to 1998, in the Fort Worth area. James makes the claim that several credible witnesses saw Rachel in the area, and further investigation suggests that these witnesses are considered credible because they are people who knew Rachel at the time of her disappearance and recognized her. According to James, quote, "Someone close to one of the girls had something to do with their disappearance." End quote. Enter Deborah Arnold Hopper. Deborah was 19 years old when her sister Rachel disappeared. She was living with Rachel and her ex-boyfriend Tommy, Rachel's husband. Although Deborah admits that she and Tommy were involved in a relationship and were even engaged at one point in time, she suggests the relationship was never very serious and that even the engagement was a half-cocked thing with a little foundation. Deborah has led a troubled life, with failed marriages and stints in rehab. When asked about it, Deborah stated, quote, "It's hard enough to deal with it that my sister's not here anymore. I had to go through lots and lots of counseling because of all the things that happened in my life." End quote. In an interview regarding her brother, Deborah stated, quote, "I know he blames me. I know he thinks I had something to do with it. Rusty thinks this letter that Tommy got the next day, he thinks I wrote it. I didn't write the letter. I don't know who did." End quote. Other members of the family, however, blame private investigator Dan James for warping Rusty's mind and turning him against his own sister. In a previous interview, when asked what she thought may have happened to her sister, Deborah said, quote, "I don't know what happened to my sister. Maybe white slavery. That's the only thing that makes sense to me. I have nothing to hide." End quote. In response to this interview, a letter was publicly released and stated the following, quote, "January 11th, 2000. Dear Deborah, we read your statement in the Fort Worth Star-Telegram on January 9, 2000. You indicated that you had nothing to hide. If your statement is true, we beg and plead with you to fully cooperate with the Fort Worth Police Department and the FBI. Please complete the polygraph testing and answer all questions. Deborah, please keep in mind, you also have a sister missing." End quote. The letter is signed by her brother, Rusty, as well as Renee Ann Moseley, Julianne's mother, and Judy and Richard Wilson, Renee's parents. It's unknown what evidence is around that causes Rusty to believe that his sister Deborah played a role in the disappearance of the three girls. Rusty and private investigator Dan James will not release the evidence in their possession. Even when asked about possible suspects, they're tight-lipped and choose not to name names. It's been nearly 40 years, and yet for some reason, these details remain held close. I have done as much research as could be done into Deborah, but there isn't a lot to find. In a radio interview, Rusty was asked about Deborah's possible involvement and stated that she had taken a polygraph and the results suggested she had knowledge of what happened that day. This has to be taken with a grain of salt for multiple reasons. One reason, which I've discussed extensively in other episodes, is the fallibility of polygraphs in the first place. Another is that there is no official police statement or report that Deborah had ever taken a polygraph, let alone been shown to have been deceptive in one. One would have to believe that had Deborah taken a polygraph and failed, she would be looked at much more closely by police, and that just doesn't seem to be the case. Or if it is, the police are being very tight-lipped about what they believe happened. It's a sad state of affairs. The loss of a family member in such an unresolved way can be brutally devastating, and it's obviously had major effects on both Rusty and Deborah. What is it that drives Rusty to believe that his sister was involved in Rachel's disappearance? But because he believes it, we have to consider his direct statements about her to be somewhat biased, even if he doesn't intend for them to be. As of this recording, I can find no evidence to support his statements about a polygraph, nor any statement from police in which Deborah is talked about as a suspect. One question which has been asked multiple times in relation to this theory is, if Deborah were involved, what was her motive? Most theorize that it would have to do with Rachel's marriage to Deborah's ex, Tommy. It's thought that perhaps Deborah was jealous and angry about the turn of events, and decided to do something to put an end to it. Crimes related to love triangles aren't uncommon, but this one is flawed for several reasons. If Deborah were involved, why would whatever happened to Rachel be done when the other two girls were with her? In addition to that, it's been reported that shortly after the disappearance, Tommy offered a $2,000 reward for information relating to Rachel. After a year, he picked up stakes and moved away, being out of contact with the families for over 20 years. Tommy is currently on his third marriage and still lives in the state of Texas. Some have viewed Tommy's behavior as suspicious, but it's entirely possible that the event was traumatic for him and he needed to get away from it. If Deborah's goal was to bring the marriage to an end due to jealousy, she would have succeeded, but she'd also have lost Tommy in the process forever. Some have theorized that perhaps Tommy and Deborah were in on it together, but again, a total lack of evidence outside of sheer speculation. Remember, there is a letter with DNA on it. Fort Worth police must have tested this DNA against both Tommy and Deborah in the year since the girls vanished. They have publicly stated that they have no matches. Not to mention, if Deborah has written the letter, wouldn't handwriting analysis have suggested this connection? I did some investigation into Tommy Trlica. He appears to currently be married with several children. By all accounts, he's led a fairly straight-laced life since the disappearance, and does not appear to have a history which would suggest that he were a cold-blooded killer or kidnapper with a deep, dark secret. The theory that Deborah played a role in her sister's disappearance is only one of many, and they get much more twisted and darker. The odd quote from Deborah about white slavery is fairly close to another theory about Rachel Trlica, Renee Wilson, and Julie Ann Moseley. There's a theory, which is purported by several individuals involved in or adjacent to the case, that the three girls were kidnapped and forced into sex slavery and made to become prostitutes. This isn't that far out there, as sex trafficking is a very serious, large criminal business. Also, due to its proximity to Mexico, Texas is a big state for these kinds of crimes. In fact, statistically speaking, nearly 1/3 of sex trafficking tips in the United States come from Texas. This theory bears a strange connection to an unsolved case involving a murder. The murder itself, that part is solved. What remains unknown is the true identity of the woman who has come to be known as Eldorado Jane Doe. In 1991, Jane Doe was murdered in room 121 of the Whitehall Motel in Eldorado, Arkansas. At the time of her death, the woman was thought to be between the ages of 18 and 30. She went by several names, including Mercedes, Kelly Lee Carr, Shannon Wiley, Cheryl Kaufman, and Cheryl Ann Wick, which was the name on the ID card found on her at the time of her death. Fairly quickly after her murder, police arrested and charged her former boyfriend and pimp, James McAlphin. McAlphin was convicted for murdering her, but in interviews and during his time in prison, he has made several strange statements in regard to not only Jane Doe, but to the 3 missing girls from Fort Worth. According to McAlphin, in an interview done with the Huffington Post, he stated, quote, "The identity is not a mystery to me, but if you solve this case, you'll find that you're also solving a couple more cold cases," end quote. McAlphin served 15 years for the murder and was released, but imprisoned again for domestic abuse. It was during this imprisonment that he started talking and claiming to reveal information in exchange for $4,000. McAlphin claimed, among many other things, that Jane Doe grew up friends with the 3 girls who disappeared from Seminary South back in 1974. According to McAlphin, he had in fact seen the girls. McAlphin states, quote, "These girls were like sisters to Mercedes. We used to visit them. They grew up in captivity in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, sometimes in the same town where their parents were. By the time they were adults, they were willing members of the stable. The younger girl died giving birth," end quote. Contrarily, Detective Cathy Phillips, a 23-year veteran of the Eldorado Police Department, gives a much different opinion, saying, quote, "I've known him since I've worked here, and he just doesn't have the truth in him," end quote. Also, Jane Doe had a history of telling completely different stories of her past and identity, which would make anything McAlphin claimed to be true hard to swallow, since even if he thought he was telling the truth, that wouldn't mean that Jane Doe had been. So is it possible that the 3 girls were kidnapped and sold into sex slavery or forced into prostitution? Sadly, yes. Although the words of a convicted murderer and former pimp aren't exactly something to base a solid foundation on, there are others who have suggested this very theory. It's been theorized that the 3 girls were taken and either drugged, beaten, or both, and forced to act as prostitutes. In more than one place, it's said that the girls were kept in the same area from which they vanished. The idea that the youngest girl, Julie Ann, who was only 9 at the time she vanished, later passed away due to complications from childbirth, is also a theory which appears frequently, although it's hard to know if this was reported before or after the interview with James McAlphin. The families have received multiple prank calls over the years, but one stuck out to Julie's mother, Rayanne. According to Rayanne, in February of 1975, less than 3 months since the disappearance, she received a strange phone call. According to Rayanne, the voice on the other end of the line said "Mama" twice, and then began to say something else, but the call was cut off. Although this can't be known for sure and could just easily have been another prank, many view this as proof that at least Julie was still alive months after the disappearance. If this is the case, it's possible the other girls were alive as well, and maybe in the same area as has been suggested. Rachel's brother Rusty, along with private investigator Dan James, have given out fragments of their theory, which also suggests that at least Rachel is still alive and in the Fort Worth area. James claims that during his work on the case, he has received anonymous death threats telling him to stay away from it. He has offered a $25,000 reward from his own bank account to information leading to the arrest or conviction of the persons responsible for the disappearance. According to James, Rachel visits the Fort Worth area during the holidays, and someone is, quote, "shrouding and manufacturing evidence," end quote. James has stated multiple times that he believes only Rachel still survives, saying, quote, "I believe that Renee Wilson is not alive. I believe that something dreadfully wrong and probably a fatality occurred involving Julie Ann Moseley," end quote. In regard to the person or persons that is shrouding evidence, James stated, quote, "I believe that person facilitates and maintains an effort to keep Rachel away from Fort Worth," end quote. This isn't much to go on, and no solid evidence has been provided to support any of it. There have not been legitimate and independently verified sightings of the three girls since the day they vanished in 1974. The idea that they were kept in the area all these years and forced into prostitution can't be ruled out, but you'd have to imagine that someone would have seen one of them sometime in the past 40 years. Obviously, the girls did not choose to leave as police originally suggested and were abducted. Or did they? One specific theory, which has been floating around for a long time, goes as follows. Rachel and Renee take Julie Ann to the mall with them, and at some point, one of several things happen. Either Rachel and Renee lose track of Julie, and she vanishes, prompting the girls to run off in hopes that they won't be in trouble for it. Another is that Rachel and Renee met up with some guys and decided to do drugs that afternoon, and in doing so, allowed Julie Ann to try some drugs as well. The theory would suggest that Julie Ann had a negative reaction to the drugs and became ill and died, prompting the other two to run off and avoid the consequences of their actions. Finally, in this line of thought, there's the theory that Rachel and Renee wanted to get rid of Julie Ann, and so they allowed a mutual friend, or someone they thought they could trust, to give her a ride home. And when she didn't arrive home, they fled. All of the theories in this line are highly suspect and extremely thin. I believe they're all extremely unlikely. But they are theories that exist, and in the interest of full disclosure, I wanted to cover them. There is a small list of highly suspect criminals who were in the area at the time. Men who have been suspected of or convicted of similar crimes in the area during the mid to late 1970s. Some of these criminals stand out more than others when it comes to possibly being involved in the disappearance. James Debarred was a convicted kidnapper, rapist, counterfeiter, and suspected serial killer. He was referred to in the press as the mall passer due to his history of passing counterfeit bills in shopping malls. While under investigation for this, the Secret Service produced composites of the man they suspected to be the mall passer. When he was captured, investigators searched his vehicle and found wads of $20 bills that were counterfeit, labeled with the city in which he planned to use them. In addition, they found a disturbing series of photographs, women's underwear, as well as audio recordings. The car was also outfitted with police lights and a siren. The photographs depicted victims in the process of being raped or murdered, and the audio appeared to be the screams of victims being tortured. According to an FBI profiler, the photos in which Debarred showed his face included victims he murdered. In the photos where his face was not shown, these were victims who he let go. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, Volume 4, listed Debarred as an example of a sexual sadist. So how does he fit into the disappearance of Rachel Trlica, Renee Wilson, and Julianne Mosley? Debarred was known to have operated in Texas, and specifically in the Fort Worth area. In fact, in what could either be an indicator of his involvement or merely a very odd coincidence. Debarred lived in his parents' home, which was in close proximity to the Seminary South Shopping Center. Another piece of information, which also possibly links Debarred to the missing girls, is the fact that part of his MO was to dress up as and impersonate figures of authority, such as police officers and security guards. Debarred was known for kidnapping potential victims, and in at least one instance, police are aware that he kidnapped and held a victim captive in the attic of his home in Fort Worth, Texas. Rusty, Rachel's brother, stated in a 2012 interview that Debarred lived a half mile from his sister's home at the time of her disappearance. The evidence is thin, but for those who believe that Debarred was involved, it essentially goes like this. If James Debarred was in the area at the time and a woman or women vanished, he was likely responsible. This could never be confirmed, and as far as I can tell, Debarred had little to say about this case, if anything at all. Investigators actually stated that they were somewhat impressed by the fact that Debarred had the ability to shut his mouth and never answer a question. Essentially, if he didn't want to talk, he didn't, and when it came to police, he did not want to talk. Ultimately, he was convicted of other crimes and sentenced to 375 years in prison. In January of 2011, Debarred died of pneumonia while incarcerated in North Carolina. His possible connection to the missing girls is speculated, but cannot be proven. Law enforcement has had little to say on the possible link between his crimes and the Fort Worth Three. Another name which comes up on the list of possibilities is Edward Howard Bell. Bell is an admitted sex offender and convicted murderer who had claimed to be a serial killer. In 1978, Bell arrived in a Pasadena, Texas suburb and emerged from his vehicle, nude from the waist down. A witness saw Bell approaching a group of children and notified her son, Larry Dickens. Dickens told his mother to call police and went outside to confront Bell. Bell attempted to leave the scene, but Dickens took the keys out of his ignition and refused to give them back. Bell produced a pistol and fired several shots into Dickens, who still held tightly to the keys. Dickens' mother was on the phone with the police and came outside to help her son. Bell demanded his keys and fired a shot into Dickens' head. He took the keys, went back to his vehicle, and returned moments later, this time with a rifle. He fired several shots into Dickens, who died on the scene before police could arrive. Police managed to catch Bell within a few hours of the crime, but he was released on bail and fled. Bell was on the run for nearly 20 years and was arrested in Panama in 1993. He was extradited back to the United States, where he was found guilty of murder and sentenced to 70 years in prison. Since his sentencing, Bell has admitted to multiple murders, kidnappings, and sex crimes. It's been reported that he's been able to describe several crimes in great detail. Bell would go on to claim that he was brainwashed by members of a top-secret government program to terrorize and murder young girls. Among the crimes Bell confessed to is the kidnapping and murder of Rachel Trlica, Renee Wilson, and Julie Ann Moseley. The problem with this is, police simply don't believe him. Bell has never been charged with any of the crimes he confessed to, and although speculative, this is likely due to the fact that his details on the incident didn't match up with evidence in possession of investigators. It's also believed that Bell had major psychological problems and is a pathological liar, so without solid proof, it's impossible to link him to any of the crimes. Much like Debarred Xi, the only thing which links him to the missing girls is the fact that he was an active killer and sex offender in the state of Texas, specifically in the Houston area, during the time these crimes were committed. The last big name on the suspect list comes with a connection to a similar case. On March 25, 1975, 10-year-old Catherine Lyons and her sister, 12-year-old Sheila Lyons, left their home in Kensington, Maryland to walk to the Wheaton Plaza Shopping Center in Wheaton, Maryland. Around 2 p.m., the girls were seen by their older brother eating pizza at the Orange Bowl restaurant. Later witnesses would report seeing the girls, apparently walking home, with the last sighting being at 2:30 p.m. The girls never arrived home. A witness came forward stating that he'd seen the girls talking to an unidentified man who was carrying a briefcase with a tape recorder inside of it. Other children reported the same man, saying that he held out a microphone for them to speak into. Police considered this a viable suspect and had a composite drawing of him passed around. Lloyd Welch would come to the mall shortly after the description of the man had been printed in the papers, and reported being there the day the Lyons sisters disappeared. Police took Welch in and questioned him about what he saw. According to Welch, he had seen the girls talking to the man with the tape recorder, and later saw the man shoving the girls into a car. Welch was given a polygraph, which he failed. When informed that he failed, Welch admitted that he made the entire story up, and police released him. No sign of the girls was found, but new information did come to light. A friend of the girls later came forward and said that a man had been staring at them at the mall and that she had confronted him. Another composite was drawn up based on this description. This description was very different from the one of the man with the tape recorder, and interestingly, the composite closely resembled a 1977 mugshot of Lloyd Welch. In February of 2014, Welch was named as a person of interest in the Lyons sisters' disappearance. In December of that year, Welch's cousin Henry Parker told detectives that in 1975, he met Welch at a property in Virginia where he helped unload 2 duffel bags from Welch's vehicle. The bags weighed around 60 to 70 pounds apiece, were stained red, and according to Parker, quote, smelled like death. Parker and Welch threw the bags into a fire, and Parker never asked any questions. 1 year later, in February of 2015, Welch was serving a lengthy sentence in Delaware on a child molestation conviction. Police indicted him on first-degree felony murder charges for his alleged responsibility for the murder of Catherine and Sheila Lyons. He was also charged with abduction and intent to defile. The bodies to this day have never been found, and Welch is currently awaiting trial on the charges. Being that Welch has a history of child molestation and is now under indictment for the murders in 1975, it isn't hard to see the connection, especially when you take a look at the timeline of where Welch had been over the years. Welch worked for a traveling carnival, which often set up in mall parking lots. In March of 1974, Welch was indeed in the state of Texas, located in Austin at the time. He would leave Texas in March of 1975, just 3 months after the Fort Worth Three disappeared, and the very month that the Lyons sisters would vanish. There were speculated connections between the cases even prior to Welch being named as a suspect in the Lyons sisters case. Both crimes involved more than one girl, and both abductions took place at a shopping mall. Curiously enough, Welch's girlfriend traveled with him, and during their time in Texas, she worked as a security guard at the Westfield Plaza shopping center. Again, we see a recurrence of the security guard theme in this case. His girlfriend has since passed away, but police are deeply interested in finding out everything they can about her life and whereabouts in connection to Lloyd Welch. The final theory I'll discuss today is a very dark one. This theory is that Rachel Trlica, Renee Wilson, and Julie Ann Moseley never left the Seminary South Shopping Center that day. Based on the fact that presents were placed in the car, it's known that at some point the girls returned to it, but it's unknown whether or not they went back in. Supposing they did, it's possible that they ran into foul play while in the mall itself. It seems unlikely. A busy mall 2 days before Christmas. Someone would have noticed something. Certainly someone would have seen something, but there were places in the mall that were not as frequently traveled. The mall itself was 3 levels and had basements beneath many of the buildings. I've seen several reports of dark basement areas and even lit ones which were used for gatherings, music events, and the like. Some have theorized that the 3 girls either entered one of these areas or were forced into one. It's entirely possible that someone could have pulled the girls into one of these areas, or they could have followed someone who convinced them to come along. Either way, if the girls wound up in one of those basement areas, they may have found themselves secluded. At this point, the suspect could have killed them, raped them, or both. It would be difficult to conceal the bodies down there, but without having been there, it's hard to know if we're talking about solid concrete basements or if there were areas of dirt or soft materials which could have been used to conceal the bodies. It's a very thin theory, but in this case, almost every theory is thin. The disappearance of Rachel Trlica, Renee Wilson, and Julianne Mosley is incredibly frustrating due to the lack of evidence and the strange circumstances under which these 3 seemingly vanished into nothing. It has broken families, turned brother against sister, and left a gaping hole where there could and should have been 3 beautiful lives lived to their fullest. December of 2014 marked the 40th anniversary of their disappearance, and a candlelight vigil was held in the very spot where the car had been found in 1974. Unfortunately, Rayanne Mosley, Julie's mom, passed away in 2014 and never got to see justice served, nor learn the fate of her daughter. During the ceremony, 3 pigeons are released representing each of the missing girls. At the vigil, a 4th pigeon was added to represent the passing of Rayanne. Despite it all, Rusty believes they're getting close to an answer. At the vigil, Rusty said, quote, "Good things are happening. I can't say it on air, but we're hoping to have some answers soon. Somebody knows something. They need to come forward and give us some peace. You know, I got to say to whoever did this, you know who you are, you know what you did. Your time's coming." End quote. Nearly 3 years later, in July of 2017, there don't appear to be any additional answers. The website Rusty compiled on the case, missingtrio.com, hasn't been updated in several years. Reportedly, Rusty has said that law enforcement requested he not update it in order to not reveal too much information to a possible suspect. Rusty was 11 years old when his sister Rachel went missing, and now he's in his mid-50s and spent his life trying to find the truth. A search which caused a rift between he and his sister Deborah. Rachel's disappearance hit the family hard, but now it's a family divided by speculation and doubt. Renee Wilson's parents don't believe they will ever see their daughter again. Her father, Richard, said in an interview, quote, "I know there's somebody out there that knows what happened, but they're keeping their mouths shut awful tight." End quote. The 3 families have grown apart over the years, talking only occasionally. Whenever a new piece of information emerges or the case shifts, they come back together, hoping for answers and hoping for justice. The Charlie Project has a page for each of the missing girls, including age-progressed images to show what they would look like today. The Doe Network, a website where volunteers can look at unidentified decedents and try to find their true identities, is frequented with possible matches to the girls, but none have stuck so far. DNA continues to find no matches, and no one has come forward with answers. Lloyd Welch rots in prison, awaiting his trial for the murders of the Lyons sisters, and it remains to be seen if any connection can be established between him and the disappearance of the Fort Worth Three. Short of a verified confession, the discovery of a body which can be matched, or a miraculous piece of evidence breaking open the case, the disappearance of Rachel Trlica, Renee Wilson, and Julianne Mosley remains an unsolved tragedy that haunts their families and all of us who have been touched by their story. Prior to researching the disappearance of the Fort Worth Three, I'd heard about the case and even read a bit about it. I knew the general story about the strange disappearance. What I didn't know is how many twists and turns there were, nor how complicated the theories would be. I have to admit, I'm sort of shocked by the minimal amount of coverage this case has gotten. I don't know if it has to do with how long it's been since it occurred, or if it's based around the fact that there appears to be so much circumstantial evidence. Other similar cases have gotten much more attention in the media and always pop up on lists of strange and shocking disappearances. Yes, I did find mention of the Fort Worth Three on these lists, but go on YouTube and look for a television clip or a documentary series about it, and you're going to be searching for a long time. Search on Google, and you'll find a lot of forums and a few newspaper articles, but most of them are regurgitating the same information and cannibalizing one another's so-called facts. During the course of my research, I reached out to Rachel's brother, Rusty. I sent a short email explaining that I would be doing my next episode on his sister's case, delivered my condolences for the loss, and asked if there were any details he wanted me to include for sure, and any information or statements he wanted to present. I didn't hear back, but I also can't imagine how often Mr. Arnold is bombarded by people looking for information. If at any point I do hear back, I'd like to have Mr. Arnold join me for a discussion of the case, which I would release later as a part 2 of this episode. Until then, I've done the best I could do to present the case as accurately as possible. Some of the information which I researched came from a website, missingtrio.com, which is run by Rusty Arnold. The site hasn't been updated in a few years, and although I'm sure there's a great deal to add, Rusty has a GoFundMe page and is attempting to raise $5,000 in an attempt to conduct some sort of test or examination related to DNA. From all accounts I've read, Rachel Trlica, Renee Wilson, and Julianne Mosley were sweet girls. They hadn't been in any kind of trouble, and for the older girls, I could find no accounts of drug use or anything criminal. Their families defined them as good girls who had so much potential and great lives ahead of them. Rachel was 17 and had been married for a few months to Thomas Trlica. She'd become a stepmother to his 2-year-old son and relished it. According to her family and Tommy, she doted on the boy and was very excited to be a part of his life. Renee had a crush on Terry Mosley, and to her heart's content, the day she vanished, he presented her with a promise ring and devoted himself to her. She was a kind girl, only 14 years of age and hardly beginning the best stages of her life. Julianne Mosley was 9, a sweet and innocent child who hadn't even begun to understand the world in which she lived. She looked at everything with a curiosity, and like most children, wanted to play with her friends and have fun. The usual for a child of that age. Who knows what these girls could have gone on to do with their lives, but sadly, that's a question which can never be answered. On December 23, 1974, everything changed for the worse, and on a simple trip to the mall to do some last-minute Christmas shopping, the girls vanished without a trace, and were never seen nor heard from again. Renee went along with her friend. At 14, it had to be exciting to be friends with a 17-year-old who could drive. She wanted to be back early, no later than 4 p.m., because she'd made plans to go to a Christmas party with Terry, and she was really excited. She wanted the extra time to get ready and to look her best. Julianne asked to tag along, mostly out of boredom that day. Her brother Terry couldn't go, with plans to visit a sick friend at his home, and told her to ask their mother. Julianne called her mother, who was working at the time, and begged and pleaded. At first, Julie's mother didn't want to let her go. She knew Renee and trusted her, but she didn't know Rachel, and wasn't sure she wanted her daughter to be driven around town with someone she didn't know. Ultimately, she acquiesced, a decision which would haunt her for the rest of her life. According to her mother, the last time she saw Julie was the night before, when she was sleeping in her bed. She could never have imagined that this would be the last time she would see her 9-year-old daughter. Rachel didn't know Julie, according to what we know, but allowed her to come along at Renee's suggestion. The three girls departed sometime before noon, made a stop at the local Army-Navy store where one of them, presumably Rachel, had some Christmas gifts on layaway. Shortly after, they proceeded to the mall and began their shopping. Many witnesses reported seeing them in the mall that day and remembered Renee's shirt, which was emblazoned with the words, "Sweet Honesty." After their disappearance, there would be multiple reports of something strange happening in the parking lot involving the girls. When police arrived on the scene, they found Christmas presents locked inside the car. This suggests the girls had exited the mall at some point and put them inside. Whether or not this was their final stop, or if they planned to go back into the mall for more shopping, is unknown. It's at this point that the three girls disappear in a manner which has baffled police, private investigators, and internet detectives for years. How is it possible that people can simply disappear? Well, it isn't. Something happened to them, and the question of what has haunted everyone involved in this case since that December 23rd. Shortly after 4 p.m., the families were worried, and by 6 p.m. they were searching the mall. By 11 p.m., the police were involved. The next day, the mysterious letter alleged to have been written by Rachel arrived in her husband's mailbox. There's been so much debate and speculation about the letter, its author, and its point of origin. Many theories would arise over the years, some purported by police, some from the families, others from independent third parties who were investigating the case for themselves, for the families, or for their own curiosity. Suspects would be named, and some connections would be made. So what of these theories and suspects? What makes sense and what doesn't? And what the hell happened here? I'm going to begin with the letter. The letter arrived the day after the disappearance. I don't know about in your town, but when I send a letter across town, it takes more than a day to arrive. Maybe in this particular area, they were pretty quick at turning mail around, but you'd have to assume the letter was dropped at the post office before 5 p.m., which is when most post offices close. This would mean that sometime between the girls' arrival at the mall at approximately 12:30, this letter would have to be written and mailed within 3 hours and 15 minutes to 3 hours and 30 minutes. It's not a long letter, so that wouldn't be a problem. But isn't it strange that there was such a rapid turnaround? I suppose the letter could have been dropped in a box overnight and processed the next morning and delivered the same day. Either way, we're talking about a pretty quick turnaround. Regardless, what was the purpose of the letter in the first place? We know that the letter claimed to be written by Rachel, and it read, quote, "I know I'm gonna catch it, but we just had to get away. We're going to Houston. See you in about a week. The car is in Sears' upper lot. Love, Rachel." End quote. First and foremost, no one who read this letter and knew Rachel thought it sounded anything like her. Secondly, everyone who knew her handwriting said it didn't look anything like it. In fact, the writing was described as being written by a child or someone who was illiterate. Also, handwriting analysis showed the letter as being written with the right hand and Rachel was left-handed. Not to mention the apparent misspelling of her name, and the fact that the letter was addressed to Thomas A. Trlica and not Tommy, as everyone who knew him referred to him. The entire letter is suspicious. Looking at what it says, I've always felt like the expression, "I know I'm gonna catch it," is strange. It feels so dismissive, like, I know I'm gonna get in trouble, but whatever. It's a very backhanded apology. Then it says, we just had to get away. Who had to get away? A 17-year-old, 14-year-old, and a 9-year-old? And get away from what? We're going to Houston. According to everyone in the girls' lives, they had no family or attachments in Houston. There was no one there and no place for them to be going. Also, if you just have to get away and you're going to Houston, why did you buy Christmas presents that night if you had no plans of delivering them? See you in about a week. The car is in Sears' upper lot. Love, Rachel. You're going away for a week without any supplies and no change of clothes. You're not telling your parents or the other girls' parents, and you're just going. This makes absolutely no sense. The entire letter is nonsensical. Rachel was friends with Renee, but she hadn't met Julie Ann until that morning. She had a 2-year-old stepson at home, a husband, and her family. There's no way this was a planned trip, and I sincerely doubt it came up out of nowhere. Also, let's play devil's advocate and pretend for a second that Rachel decided to take this trip. Why would she take the other girls with her, especially Julie Ann? If there's anything in this case that I consider to be an absolute fraud, it's this letter. I don't believe it for a second. I don't believe that Rachel wrote it and that the girls decided to get away, that they decided to take a 9-year-old with them, or that they were going anywhere by their own choice. This letter is an absolute fabrication from start to end. So the question becomes, who wrote it and why? The first, and I think most likely theory, is that the letter was written by an abductor or abductors. Assuming they abducted the girls, and since Rachel was driving, it would have been fairly easy to obtain her address from her license or by forcing her to tell it. Back during the 70s, a lot of disappearances were written up as runaways. There are several examples of murderers and kidnappers who would forge letters to the victims' families, either to buy themselves time, confuse police, or simply to throw investigators off their trail. Possible. Absolutely. I can't begin to get into the mindset of someone who would be twisted enough to commit this crime, but considering how twisted it is, it's hard to imagine the person or persons wouldn't do something like this. Also, the letter is described as being possibly written by a child. Is it possible that the abductor forced Julie Ann to write this letter? I think that's very possible. One detail about the letter that's always fascinated me is the way Tommy's name was written as Thomas A. Trlica. It feels very formal, but how did they get his middle initial? Maybe they looked him up in the phone book, but this seems like a strange effort. It's the middle initial which makes me feel like it was written to seem like the author didn't know Tommy. But the letter was supposed to be written by his wife, so that doesn't make any sense. I think this may imply it was written by someone who knew him, and this was an effort to make it seem like they didn't. Very, very strange. The other possibility, and the one which many of the family members believe, including Rachel's brother, is that her sister Deborah wrote the letter. Testing was conducted, and from everything I've seen, they were unable to prove that she wrote it. She was asked multiple times to take a polygraph, and Rusty claims that she eventually consented and that the results showed deception. I can't find any actual proof of this, nor a statement from the authorities confirming it. The question is, could Deborah have knowledge of what happened, have written the letter, planned the whole thing, or maybe some combination of all three? In ancient Rome, when a crime was committed, the Romans would ask, cui bono, which means who benefits. Did Deborah benefit in any way from this happening? None that we know of. Some have speculated that because of her previous relationship with Tommy, she was jealous and wanted her sister Rachel out of the picture. Crimes like these are not uncommon, even amongst family members. But Tommy left town a year after the disappearance. From everything we know, Deborah and Tommy did not get involved following Rachel's disappearance, so if it was him she wanted, that didn't work out for her. Some have called Deborah a drama queen, someone who always wants attention, but the disappearance of her sister shifted all attention away from her. Not to mention, she's been fairly restrained in terms of interviews and media appearances, so this doesn't seem to be something she wanted. There's the possibility that there was some kind of monetary exchange involved, that Deborah was paid to set her sister up, but this doesn't make sense to me either. I honestly believe that if Deborah has knowledge of the disappearance, it isn't as a co-conspirator, but perhaps something she found out after, or a person she suspects of being involved. Whatever the case is with Deborah, we may never know. I know she had some troubled times in her life following the disappearance. You can argue infinitely whether or not these were demons that she faced as a result of her grief or of her possible guilt. She has stated publicly time and time again that she doesn't know what happened or where her sister could be. Members of the family, including her own brother, have implicated her in the disappearance. There is no evidence to support their claims, and when Deborah gave a public interview, they responded with a letter begging for her to tell what she knows. If Deborah knows anything, she isn't talking. I honestly don't know where I stand on this. It's so hard to imagine someone would do this to their own sister, but stranger and more twisted things have happened. I think the problem I have with the entire scenario involving Deborah is, if she wanted revenge on Rachel, why take it out on Renee and Julie as well, unless she didn't know they were going to be there? When even your brother thinks you have a part to play in things, that doesn't speak well of your character. I can't say whether or not she was involved, but I do believe it's possible that she knows more than she's telling, even if it's just a gut feeling or suspicion. Moving forward, we have the words of the convicted murderer James McAlpin, who murdered Eldorado Jane Doe, and claims that she was friends with the girls from Fort Worth, that they'd been kept in a home and forced into prostitution. The man gives very few details and claims he'll give more for $4,000. That's a really strange sum of money to request, especially when an investigator's already offered $25,000 in exchange for information leading to an arrest. I'm not going to get too deep into McAlpin because, frankly, I don't believe a word the guy has to say. He's a notorious liar, he's a convicted murderer who still denies he committed the crime, despite the fact that witnesses were there. I honestly believe he just chose something he thought people would pay him for. I consider every statement of James McAlpin's to be complete and utter trash. He won't even reveal the true name of Eldorado Jane Doe, which frankly, I doubt he even knows. This is a red herring mixed into the case, and I think to invest too much time or thought on someone like James McAlpin is a complete waste of time. Then we have the theory that the girls chose to run away under some dark circumstances, namely being that either Rachel or Renee lost track of Julie Ann, and when she couldn't be found they decided to run. The second part of the possibility was that, at some point, Rachel and Renee met up with some people, got involved in drugs, and Renee died either by indulging in the drugs or by some other method, and in order to escape punishment for the incident, Renee and Rachel ran off. I think both of these theories are pretty silly and fairly flawed. Looking at the latter first, it seems unlikely that Renee and Rachel would be capable of disposing of Julianne's body in such a way that it would never be found. I also consider it highly unlikely that if they left of their own accord, that they could go 40 years without ever contacting anyone in their families. We know that Rachel cared deeply for her stepson, and to simply dispose of Julianne's body is in direct contrast to that personality type. I can't believe that for a second. If Julianne was kidnapped or lost, I fully believe that Rachel and Renee would have been seen looking for her and would have asked for help and would have called the police. Again, neither of these theories makes a great deal of sense to me, and seem more like the result of people grasping at straws. I don't believe either of them, and I don't put any weight into them. I don't believe either Rachel or Renee were the types of people who would do something like this. There simply isn't any evidence to suggest either of these theories could be possible. As I stated in the evidence section of the episode, I simply covered this theory in the interest of full disclosure. This brings us to the theory that convicted murderer and rapist James Debarred Xi was responsible. I think this is the first theory that carries some merit. Debarred Xi was known for kidnapping, raping, and murdering women. He was defined as a sexual sadist, and police said in interrogation he was nearly impossible to break. He has a long history of crime and lived in the same area at the same time. We know he made audio recordings and took photos of the victims. As far as I understand, none of the photos appear to depict any of the three girls. That doesn't mean he wasn't involved. I suppose he could have had more photos somewhere that were never discovered. But his crimes were one-on-one. He wasn't known to strike against multiple women at the same time. Debarred Xi held one particular victim in the attic of a home in Fort Worth, and at the time of the disappearance, he supposedly lived less than half a mile from Rachel. Is it possible that he saw Rachel at some point in time and decided he wanted to take her? Yes. Also factor in that Debarred Xi was known for frequenting shopping malls where he passed counterfeit money and could easily have been at Seminary South. The detail I find most fascinating is that he was also reported to wear uniforms to gain his victims' trust. Several witnesses put the girls in the company of a man in a security guard uniform. Is it possible that this man was Debarred Xi? I'd have to say yes. So he was in the area, he kidnapped, raped, and murdered, and dressed in uniforms to trick his victims. All of these would match up and make Debarred Xi a likely suspect. The problem is, he wasn't going to admit to anything he didn't want to, and even if the police questioned him on the topic of the Fort Worth Three, it's unlikely that he would have told them. At that point, it wasn't a matter of not wanting to get convicted, but more likely a matter of getting some sick pleasure out of keeping the secret. I think there's a very good chance that Debarred Xi played a role in this crime. My problem is, it seems unlikely that this could have been a random encounter. If he had seen Rachel, or maybe one of the other girls, and decided he was going to take her, I can't imagine he'd have felt as comfortable doing it when there were three of them. 3 victims are hard to control, and though there are ways of doing it, I feel like he'd have been dissuaded by trying to take all of them at once. Any of them could have screamed out or ran, and he'd have been needing to make a quick exit. Had he put on a security guard's uniform, he may have been able to get them into his vehicle, but that would be a very big gamble for him to make. And to commit the crime in broad daylight at a busy mall just doesn't seem like his style. He got away with his crimes for a very long time, and most of what he had done wasn't even known until they found the photographs in his car when searching it on an unrelated case. He was a sick individual, but not a stupid and impulsive one. Also, police have stated they believe more than one person was involved, and he was definitely a loner. There's the possibility that he had stalked one of the girls and followed her to the mall that day. But it seems more likely he would have waited for her to be alone before making his move. The idea of there being 3 is the key piece which dissuades me from believing he is responsible, but many other details put me in a position of having to say that Debarred Xi is my number 1 suspect in this crime. Edward Howard Bell is next on the list, but only exists on the list because he confessed to the crime along with many others. Much like the case of James McAlpin, here we have a career criminal with a long history of lying. In addition to that, Bell is reported to have had psychological issues, although no one will go into much detail about it. Bell operated in Texas and was known to be a rapist, child molester, and murderer. After the murder of Larry Dickens, Bell is reported to have broken into a woman's home with the intent of raping her and possibly murdering her. Bell was ran off, though, when the woman produced a gun. In the Dickens murder, he was brazen, exposing himself to children in broad daylight, and then committing murder right in front of the victim's mother. This is an interesting contrast, and I think signifies impulse control and an inability to calculate consequences, or to simply not care about them. I don't think his crimes match up with what happened to Rachel, Renee, and Julie. He was a convicted murderer, but he wasn't considered to be a serial killer. Police were unable to establish a history of these kinds of crimes, and were never able to verify his involvement in any of the murders or crimes he reportedly took credit for. I think Bell is a consideration, but a slim one, and I don't see anything in particular that points towards him being involved in this crime, other than the fact that he was in Texas at the time it occurred. Lloyd Welch is another suspect who was known to be in Texas at the time. Welch's involvement in the kidnapping murder of the Lyons sisters has been well established, and we know this crime took place in March of 1975, just 3 months after the disappearance in Fort Worth. The problem I have with Welch is that he was a pedophile and a child molester. The Lyons sisters were 12 and 10 at the time he abducted them. This fits his profile. Julianne was 9, Renee was 14, so they might have fit his MO, but Rachel certainly didn't. I think if anything, the presence of someone older would have been enough to dissuade Welch from approaching the girls. In the case of the Lyons sisters, he's alleged to have taken them in broad daylight. The problem is, they were young and possibly easy for him to trick. Rachel wouldn't be, and I doubt she'd have gone along with him without making a fuss about it. It's always possible he had a weapon and threatened the girls with it to keep them quiet, but I find it difficult to believe he'd make a move with someone older present. Police records indicate that he was in Austin from January of 74 to March of 75. Austin is approximately 175 miles south of Fort Worth, a nearly 3-hour drive. It's certainly possible that Welch visited the Fort Worth area and spent time there, but there's nothing to place him there at any point in time. We know that Welch had a girlfriend who was a security guard in Austin, so it's not outside of the realm of possibility that he used her to lure the girls into a situation from which they couldn't escape. Of course, this suggests that his girlfriend was in on his crimes, and at least in the case of the Lyons sisters, there's been nothing to indicate that she was in on that. Some have theorized that Welch could have taken his girlfriend's uniform and pretended to be a security guard to lure the girls in himself. Possible, but I think unlikely. Welch would have had to have been at the mall that day with the uniform ready to go and felt courageous enough to kidnap 3 girls from a busy mall parking lot. I think that's a lot of details that have to line up, and though truth can sometimes be stranger than fiction, I think Welch's involvement in this crime is a reach. Since his indictment, other victims have come forward and accused Welch of attempting to abduct them. He is suspected of 14 criminal incidents between 1973 and 1997. In a lot of these cases, though, where potential victims escaped, it was because someone else arrived or the victim drew attention to the man. In one particular incident, a 12-year-old girl's brother came walking up and Welch ran off. If he's willing to run away from a child, I think it's much more likely he's going to run away from a 17-year-old. A lot of people link Welch to the crime because he kidnapped the Lyons sisters from near a mall, and Rachel, Renee, and Julie were taken from a mall, but that's an extremely thin connection. I think that Welch should be looked at and questioned in relation to this crime, but I don't think he's right for it. I think he's a sick, disturbed criminal, but unless something more is discovered, anything that links him to the Fort Worth 3 is basically a leap of faith. I briefly discussed the theory that the girls may have never left the mall that day. That would fall under the concept of a total stranger abduction or murder. There are 2 ways I could see this going. Someone, or a group of someones, saw the girl that day and decided to do something horrible. Either they wanted to rape, murder, rob, abduct, or some combination of all. The mall did have basement areas where things like this could be concealed, but short of being able to dig a hole through the floor or find an open space between some walls, I don't think it's possible that the girls' bodies could have been concealed there. Although it's possible, I consider it less likely. I suppose it's possible they could have been attacked in one of these basement areas and then put into a truck or car trunk, but it's unlikely someone wouldn't have noticed something like this going on. Online, there's been some debate over a photo that was found floating around discussion boards related to convicted rapist and serial killer Rodney Alcala. He's often famously referred to as the dating game killer. Since he appeared on the television show in 1978, right in the middle of his murder spree. In this photo, there's a woman who bears a striking resemblance to Rachel Trlica. It appears to be somewhat of an old-school style selfie. Many people think this photo is of Rachel, and that this photograph connects Alcala to the Fort Worth Three. The main problem with this claim, and the reason I didn't include it in the evidence section, is that Alcala was incarcerated in 1974. He couldn't physically have been present in Fort Worth or at the mall on December 23rd. He wasn't released until 1977. Although this is a hotly debated theory, it doesn't seem plausible to me. So that leaves the possibility that a stranger, or strangers, abducted all three girls at some point that afternoon or early evening. We've heard Rachel's sister suggest the possibility of white slavery. James Mcgowan claimed the girls were held captive and forced into prostitution. These are sadly possibilities, but I find it hard to believe they could be so thoroughly controlled as to live in the same area from which they disappeared and to never make contact with their families. We know Rusty claims that Rachel's been seen in the area in the years since she vanished, but there doesn't appear to be anything to corroborate this. I think, if a stranger abduction took place, that all three girls were sadly, likely murdered within days or even hours of their abduction. The Christmas gifts were still in the car, and the car was left behind. So whoever did this had his own transportation. I don't think robbery was a motive, since I don't think a thief would also kidnap the three women. I think this leaves us with a motive of murder and possibly rape. What I've always wondered is, how would the stranger have gotten all three under his control without creating a scene? Maybe a weapon. Or would it have been easier to trick the girls into a false sense of security? This is where the idea of a security guard or police impersonator comes into play. Debarred Xi would dress up to trick his victims. In at least one instance, Lloyd Welch claimed to be a police officer to trick a potential victim. It isn't impossible that someone else was doing something similar. We have two witnesses who claim to have spotted the girls in the presence of a male security guard and a truck. The female witness stated she saw a security guard, quote, hustling the girls into his truck. The other witness, former Fort Worth police officer and Sears security guard Hutchins, says he interacted with the security guard who had the three girls in his truck. For a long time, I thought it was possible that this so-called security guard could have been an imposter. That would work in the case of the female witness, but you'd assume Hutchinson would know a fellow security guard unless he wasn't claiming to be a Sears security guard. According to Fort Worth police, they eventually tracked down the security guard that Hutchinson said he saw and questioned him about the girls, but he swore he hadn't seen them and that they'd never been in his truck. Is it possible that Hutchinson gave the name of a security guard that worked there at the time, but this wasn't the man who he had spoken to that day, and so police questioned the wrong man? It's a very convoluted path to take, but if we're dealing with a security guard and a possible imposter in the same place at the same time, it could get quite confusing, especially when it exists only in the memory of a man that's been warped by the passage of nearly 30 years. If it were an imposter, he could have easily told Hutchinson that he worked for another store or the mall itself, and Hutchinson would have had no reason to doubt him. He could have even given Hutchinson the name of another security guard who worked for the mall, which would explain how police managed to find him and question him years later, and there's no way of knowing if this was the man Hutchinson knew previously or was seeing for the first time. I can't help but question whether Hutchinson ever saw this man working again and could verify that it was the same person, or if he never saw him again after that day. I often wonder if Hutchinson was shown photos of Debarred Xi or Welch. I would like to believe he was, but he wasn't interviewed for nearly 30 years after the incident occurs, and memories fade. Neither Welch nor Debarred Xi was known for sending letters to the victims' families, but that happens in this case, and to this day I still don't fully understand why, and neither do the families. There are so many details that just don't make sense. The idea that three girls can go to a mall and vanish into nothing is remarkably frustrating, baffling, and tragic. There are pieces of evidence which exist, but have never been able to provide much. The DNA found on the letter, for one. It's there, and it's been tested against many suspects, but to no avail. Witnesses who claim to have seen the girls, but these accounts could never be verified. It's truly startling how something like this could happen, and in the more than 40 years since, nothing much has been figured out. No major leads, no new evidence, no strongly supported theories, at least none that investigators will share with us. Rusty and Dan James, his private investigator friend, claim to have further information, but they aren't talking either. The one major issue with the stranger abduction situation is police firmly believe that at least one of the girls knew or trusted the person and went along willingly. Police have said they believe the girls chose to go with this person, and things only turned out badly after they were in his or her company. This is an interesting fact, which could tie back to the idea of Rachel's sister Deborah knowing more or somehow being involved. If she knew the person who was responsible, there's a good chance that Rachel would have known this person well. Of course, it's entirely possible that we have someone pretending to be in a position of authority, such as a police officer or mall security guard, as previously discussed. I'm curious what it is that makes police so sure the girls went along willingly. They may not have found signs of a struggle, but some witnesses reported seeing the girls forced into vehicles, which doesn't sound willing to me. Every detail seems to lead to a dead end or a vicious cycle of questions, more questions, and no answers. Rachel Trlica, Renee Wilson, and Julianne Mosley were last seen at Seminary South Shopping Center in Fort Worth, Texas on December 23, 1974. Theories abound about what could have happened to them. Suspects are listed, but few legit connections can be made. There are questions aplenty and answers so few. How can it be that these three girls could simply vanish without a trace, and nearly half a decade later, we know almost nothing more than we did the day they disappeared? This tragic crime left families shattered, divided brothers and sisters, confounded the police, and with each year that passes, names are forgotten, relatives pass away, and the memories that still keep the girls alive become a little more fragmented. Although I would love to believe it's possible that the girls survived, my heart cannot overpower my mind. Unfortunately, I do believe the girls are gone and were likely murdered before or slightly after the letter was delivered to Tommy. Short of a miraculous piece of evidence surfacing to break the case, an outright confession, or the discovery of one or more of their bodies, this case may never have a resolution. The disappearance of the Fort Worth Three is a cautionary tale. There are people out there who only wish to do harm and who have the darkest of intentions. One day, perhaps we will learn the fate of Rachel Trlica, Renee Wilson, and Julianne Mosley. Until then, the disappearance of the Fort Worth Three remains a haunting and heartbreaking mystery. If you're interested in finding more information about Rachel Trlica, Renee Wilson, Julianne Mosley, and the disappearance of the Fort Worth Three, there are a few websites and a lot of forums you can find. You can discuss it with me and other podcast listeners on Facebook. The Facebook group can be found simply by searching for Trace Evidence Podcast. If you have information regarding the Fort Worth Three, please contact the Fort Worth Police, the FBI, or your local police department. What do you think happened to Rachel, Renee, and Julie? I want to hear your theories and thoughts on this case. I want to extend an offer to Rusty Arnold, Deborah Arnold, or members of any of the three families. If you'd like to discuss this case, I would be glad to have you on to talk about it with me. You can tweet me at TraceEvPod, email me at traceevidencepod@gmail.com, or comment in the Facebook group. I want to thank you for listening to this episode of the Trace Evidence Podcast, and invite you to check out our website at trace-evidence.com. You can find links to our Patreon, all of our social media accounts, as well as places to download and subscribe to the podcast. I'm always eager to hear your feedback. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a good rating on iTunes and leave us a review. This will greatly help our reach and bring more attention to these cases. Thank you for listening, and I hope you'll join us next week for another unsolved case on the next episode of Trace Evidence.